Good morning. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning for an emergency briefing to discuss the violence in Palestine and Israel that we've seen since Saturday. I appreciate all of your attendance. I appreciate our panelists who I'll introduce in a moment for joining us during these difficult days. My name is Josh Rubner, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Institute for Middle East Understanding. Our organization is a nonprofit organization that provides to journalists and to decision makers facts, analysis, experts, and digital resources about Palestine and Palestinians. As we all know, since Saturday, more than 900 Israelis and more than 750 Palestinians have been killed. It's a time of unprecedented grief and anguish and sorrow for many people in Palestine, Israel. And we want to start this webinar by recognizing that all human lives are precious, that the deliberate attacks against civilians that we're seeing are always wrong and can never be justified. And while this level of violence may be unprecedented in scope, in terms of what Israeli civilians are facing today, sadly, this scope of violence directed against civilians is not unprecedented for Palestinian civilians. And of course, we also have to understand that the clock did not start on Saturday. There's a history and a context that we need to discuss to have a proper understanding of the events that we're seeing unfolding today. Now is the time to approach Palestine-Israel with wisdom and with understanding. Now is the time to save lives, not to exacerbate the violence by providing Israel with more weapons. Now is the time for us to reevaluate the actions that all of us can take to bring about the safety and peace that everyone, Palestinians and Israelis alike, deserve. Now is the time to realize that there is simply no going back to the status quo of Israeli apartheid and oppression and Israel's denial of freedom to the Palestinian people. Now is the time for all of us to pursue justice and realize justice so that peace may ensue. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the clock didn't start on Saturday. We have hopefully with us three excellent panelists today who will help us contextualize the human, the political, the legal, and the historical dimensions of the violence that is taking place in Israel, Palestine today. Very unfortunately, Fadi Abu Shamala, who was hoping to join us from Gaza, is most likely unable to join us, which is a testament to the fact that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are facing extremely dire circumstances right now. Israel has cut the electricity to the Gaza Strip, cut fuel imports, it's cut internet access, it's cut all food and goods imports, and every Palestinian in the Gaza Strip is simply struggling to survive the onslaught right now. So we understand that Fadi is taking care of his safety and the safety of his family as best he can, and sends his regrets that he's probably unable to join us. Let me introduce our expected three panelists, and then we'll get into questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Our first panelist is Zaha Hassan. She is a human rights lawyer and a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her research focuses on Palestine-Israel peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements in U.S. foreign policy in the region. Previously, she was the coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership, and was a member of the Palestinian delegation to the quartet-sponsored exploratory talks between 2011 and 2012. She regularly participates in Track 2 peace efforts and is a contributor to The Hill and Haaretz. Her commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, Salon, Al Jazeera English, CNN, and others. Daniel Levy, who we're hoping will join us shortly, is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project, which emphasizes the Palestine-Israel issue alongside regional conflicts, trends, and geopolitics. From 2012 to 2016, Levy was the director of the Middle East and North Africa at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow and director of New America's Middle East Task Force in Washington, D.C., and senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York. Daniel was a senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister and to Justice Minister Yossi Beilin during the government of Ehud Barak from 1999 to 2001, and a member of the official Israeli delegation to peace talks at Taba under Barak and at Oslo II under Yitzhak Rabin in 1994 and 1995. Finally, and we really appreciate Hani Almadhoun for filling in at the last minute on an emergency basis. Born in the UAE, Hani's family fled to the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. It was tough adjusting to the harsh conditions in Gaza during the first Intifada, but his family was made whole again when his dad got a job at an UNRWA school teaching English to refugees. Child of an educator, Hani was raised with the mantra of school being the top priority, and in this pursuit, he eventually found his way to the U.S., thanks to a university scholarship from the LDS Church. After earning both his master's in public administration and his BA in international studies and Latin American studies from Brigham Young, Hani settled in Washington, where he fell into the world of fundraising for various causes that spoke to him, including civil rights and social justice groups for Muslim and Arab Americans and charities that serve the Palestinian people and other marginalized communities in the Middle East. Currently, Hani is UNRWA USA's Director of Philanthropy, but I want to emphasize that Hani is speaking in his individual capacity today, not as a representative of UNRWA USA. And I'd like to start with you, Hani. And first of all, I'd like to extend my condolences to you because you've already experienced the horror of Israel's attack against the Gaza Strip and lost precious family members in this attack. I can't imagine how difficult it is for you to join us and to talk about this issue on this day. And we really appreciate your presence here. And we're so sorry for your loss. I want to start with you. And I want to start with a question that provides an overview of the Gaza Strip today. Can you paint a picture for us of what life is like right now for Palestinians under Israeli military attacks in Gaza? And more broadly speaking, can you talk about the impact that Israel's more than 15-year-long siege has impacted life for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip? And also specifically, if you can address the issue of how Israel has already cut off electricity, food, and other imports to Gaza, how this will impact life for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip even further.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, it's not easy. You know, it's 14 persons, family members, a brother, and two brothers and their kids and their spouses. And that happened in Beit Lahia near the American school. So sadly, when the news came in Telegram, they said the name of the family. Mind you, we have a big family. And then they said the name of the town. It happens to be where my family lives. And then my heart dropped. Obviously, every loss of civilian life is heartbreaking. You know, we panicked. And then, you know, more news came from social media that it's another family, not my own family. My immediate family is fine, but the other family is not so lucky. and I feel sad for our relatives. And I know that there is a lot more stories like that, sadly, will continue to come from Gaza. And since the event started, we have not been able to get a hold of our family. They live in Beit Lahia up north. The internet and the phone services have been disrupted. Mind you, the electricity is not there anymore. So we're having a lot of issues connecting with family. And, you know, we know those places. We just came back 2 months ago from Gaza, and we were, you know, we're happy to see that people starting to, you know, have opportunities. Maybe there's a sense of life in the summer in Gaza because it's a beach town, a very sad beach town right now. And then you go and, you know, the reality is a lot of death is happening. My family is unable to check on each other. The 14 people who got killed, nobody's able to bury them. Nobody's able to have a funeral service for them because death is all around. Mind you, my family is in Beit Lahia. My home is in Tel El Hawa, which is next to Rimal. And Rimal used to be the posh area in Gaza where the district, the business district, and now not anymore. So that creates a lot of conflict. You know, you've seen the 180,000 Palestine refugees inside schools in Gaza. That's just heartbreaking. And what's even more brutal is the fact that people are dying. My sister Niveen went to the store to buy bread the other day, yesterday, and the Jabalia carnage, the massacre where they killed 50 people around the transformer area, that's where she escaped it by 1 minute. And she said, you know, there was a lot of, it's a bloodbath, basically. That's how she described it. And mind you, these are civilians, you know, I don't, you know, my family just wants to, you know, my dad has a grocery store. He hasn't been able to open. Everybody's calling him, do you have sugar? Do you have salt? Do you have flour? And it's a small store, like maybe like 3 meters by 3 meters square. And a lot of people are calling him to see if he has supplies. His supplier got bombed, which where he got his food. And we're talking about basic necessities here. They do not have water. My sister said they had water for 2 hours yesterday. She said today she doesn't think they will have water. We've seen videos of Israeli soldiers showing themselves shutting the main water line in Gaza. Electricity, it used to be a problem, 6 hours. Now it's not, it's 0 hours in most parts. Solar panels do help Gaza right now, but there's not a lot of them because remember, they're on top of the buildings. A lot of those buildings are no more. And, you know, we're talking about entire families that have been erased from the civil registrations. You know, if you want that information, you can find it. And it's just heartbreaking. I try to help professionally in my line of work to figure out how to help, but even with that, this is war is different. Nobody's given a slightest idea how to bring stuff into Gaza anymore. You know, you're not talking about medicine going in. You're not everybody's talking we can help, but the reality is we're all frozen our tracks. And like, how can we help, right? Like, America may be helping with the war now, but then you know, I'm sure I imagine they want to help in the rebuilding, but they're not even talking about that now. So just to bring it back to the families, there's a lot of horrors. And I've had family members message me somehow to tell me that, hey, if anything happens to them, I should adopt their daughters or their kids. And those are serious people that, you know, I care for. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Hani. And again, my condolences for your loss and for the terrible, terrible situation facing your family and, you know, the entire civilian population of the Gaza Strip. Let me turn to Zaha right now. Zaha, you are expert in international law. It's widely expected that Israel will shortly launch a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, in addition to the air invasion that's preceded it by several days. As an expert in international law, can you talk to us about what are the obligations of state actors and non-state actors during an armed conflict? And can you talk to us a bit about the previous Israeli air and ground attacks that Palestinians in Gaza have experienced repeatedly, and whether the parties have been in compliance with their obligations under international law, and whether there's been accountability to address violations of international law?
Thanks, Josh. Before I answer that question, I just want to give Daniel an opportunity because I think he's shorter on time. Daniel, are you okay? Or
I am. I'm terribly sorry. I had a bit of a system breakdown, but I'm with you, and I'm good through the hour. So Zaha, please carry on.
Okay, great. Thanks. First of all, just to recognize that a lot of people joining us and people on this, people presenting today have family, friends, and loved ones in the region, and just want to recognize that today is Mental Health Day, and I can tell you that we're all struggling today, but I just wanted to recognize that we're speaking as analysts and such, but we're also human beings, and we're this is a difficult time for all of us. So Josh, your question about the international legal obligations in a situation like this, both Israel and Hamas are under a legal obligation to avoid targeting civilians or recklessly, engaging in military activities without regard to civilian life. Israel is the occupying power, and as such, it does have a duty also to protect the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, just like it has a duty to protect the lives of Israeli civilians. Gaza is still occupied territory. Israel controls all aspects of Palestinian life in Gaza, from birth to death and everything in between, whether it's access to food and water and electricity. These are all things Israel controls. It can come in and out of Gaza at will, as we are now waiting for the Israeli military to possibly enter with ground troops. It should be noted that Palestinians have an international legal right to resist occupation, but like Israel, Palestinian resistance fighters must be guided by the legal doctrine of distinction and proportionality. So what we know from past bombardments and invasions of Gaza is Israel has not distinguished between Hamas or Islamic Jihad fighters in Gaza. Hamas attacks from Gaza in the last couple of decades, since the Second Intifada ended, have been mainly indiscriminate rocket fire from Gaza, which makes it very difficult for them to distinguish between military targets and civilians because of the crude nature of Hamas's weaponry. In 2008, 2009, when Israel waged a military assault on Gaza known as Operation Cast Lead, at that time, between 1,200 and 1,400 Palestinians were killed. Mostly these were civilians. There was a group of UN investigators and international experts who investigated the situation and the aftermath of that bombardment. And they found both Israel and Hamas guilty of war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. The experts that were involved, the UN experts that were involved in that review of what happened, had recommended that the ICC that there be a referral to the ICC about the situation. And since then, there have been many more major attacks on Gaza and Hamas missile fire in the context of those attacks as well, from 2012, 2014. And there have been commissions of inquiry related to those attacks as well that found possibly war crimes in those contexts as well. In 2018, when Palestinians in Gaza were protesting their encapsulation and in a protest called the Great March of Return, there was also indiscriminate attacks on unarmed protesters during the more than year-long protests that were taking on that. And in that context as well, there was a UN Commission of Inquiry that found that Israel was deliberately targeting Palestinian protesters, killing them or targeting their limbs and paralyzing them. So the issue of attacks on Palestinians in Gaza has been an ongoing problem, and it's one that has yet to see accountability in the context of those previous bombardments of Gaza or attacks on civilians in Gaza. In fact, there's been a little movement. The ICC has with it sitting complaints about the 2014 and the attacks since then in the West Bank, claims related to settlements, claims related to the treatment of prisoners, and those have not advanced at all in the many years that the ICC has been deliberating and thinking about whether or not to move forward with a criminal case. And so what I want to just stress is this lack of accountability is what's breeding impunity. And I'm very concerned at this present moment because what we're seeing happening right now, for me, is very reminiscent of the period in 1982 that led to the Sovereign Shatila massacre in Lebanon. Now, that was a relatively smaller scale Israeli supported attack on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. But the stuff that was made of, the Israeli interest in neutralizing a Palestinian resistance movement, then the PLO in Lebanon, the encapsulation of the Palestinians and Lebanese were also attacked in that in refugee camps that they couldn't escape from, and this dehumanization of Palestinian lives, those ingredients exist today in what we're seeing in Gaza right now. And I'm very concerned that the 2.2 million people there don't have the international community's attention or support to try to pull Israel back from the brink in terms of its response to the Israeli civilian deaths that we've seen since Saturday. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Zaha, for that very informative legal and historical overview. I want to turn to Daniel. Daniel, many people consider that the current Israeli government is the most extreme, the most racist to ever hold power to date in that country. As we see these attacks on Gaza by Israel continuing to unfold, can you talk to us about the policy ramifications of having people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich in these very prominent decision-making roles? What do you see as the implications of Israel having declared war on Gaza in a national emergency, and to hear statements from the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, talking about the people of Gaza as being, quote, human animals?
Josh, thank you for having me with you. It appears extremely challenging for people, and I understand at one level, but it also shouldn't be the case. To be able to hold simultaneously the thought that the images one saw, what happened on the weekend, was unconscionable and heartbreaking. And the idea that one can publicly commit to war crimes against 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and the world shrugs and commits support and promises more weapons to undertake this war crime. Surely, just as humans, and we can talk about the history in a moment, but surely as humans, it's not so difficult to hold those two things at the same time, that one unconscionable act does not merit, excuse, a public commitment to a heinous war crime, a promise. Now, the dehumanizing runs deep, and I won't spend too much time on this, but it's always important to step back and acknowledge that history didn't begin at 6 a.m. Saturday morning. There's a story to why Palestinians in Gaza still are refugees. What are those areas they're looking out onto on southern Israel? For many of those in refugee communities, those are the areas and the homes that them and their families came from originally before the Nakba, before the ethnic cleansing and dispossession. And here we have another threat of ethnic cleansing. But when people puff up their chests and talk about how can you do this to civilians, what was the displacement of civilians that led Gaza to being the place it is today? And who was that conducted by? And how have we allowed a decade and a half of an open-air prison, of a blockade and a siege? Now, you asked about the particularly extreme nature of this Israeli government. And I want to speak to that and also to place it in context, because it does make a difference. And I think it has made a difference to the moment we are at today, that you have in the government, and not just from the, well, you actually mentioned Netanyahu as well, from not just from the religious Zionism party. It's composed of different factions, but that was the banner they ran on jointly, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, in the last election, but also from the Likud party. You've had people who are openly calling for a second Nakba. It's become a motif, a mantra in Israeli politics. It matters that you have people, and it matters specifically to what happened just now. My friend Danny Seidemann often refers to Jerusalem and the Holy Esplanade in the Old City as nitroglycerine. It matters that you have someone in the government who has been determined to provoke and push buttons when it comes to the visits of Ben-Gvir and of others, and of shifting the status quo on Al-Aqsa. It matters that you have the encouragement of settler militia rampages. It matters. But one should also bear in mind that the leader of the opposition, or the person who's highest in the polls at the moment, the leader of the opposition is Lapid. The person I'm referring to is the former defense minister, Benny Gantz. He may well be back in government very, very quickly. When he entered politics, people may not be aware of this, they may have stumbled across it and forgotten. When Gantz entered politics and first ran, do you know what his campaign was? His campaign was about reminding people that he was the guy who destroyed Gaza in a previous round when he was the defense minister. So I don't want us to fall into this easy place to go lull of, you know, if only we could be back in the Lapid, Gantz, Bennett government. And also for Israelis, because there's a narrative coming out of Israel, which is, well, it's obvious how come this unbelievable failure of deterrence, intelligence, military. It's because Netanyahu's obsessed with the judicial overhaul, and Ben-Gvir and his gang are obsessed with just protecting the settlements on the West Bank, and so they're taking their eye off the ball in Gaza. The malaise, whether it's the military malaise that led to the degree of loss of capacity and the decomposition in the system that opened up the possibility of this, or the deeper malaise in the Israeli system, it runs much deeper. The escalation in the West Bank, in Area A, as it's called, began during the Lapid-Gantz-Bennett government. The criminalizing of Palestinian NGOs who document the very crimes we're seeing at the moment began then. So yes, there is a particular brand of in-your-face, provocative extremism to the current government, but there's a deeper problem, and the hope, not today, not tomorrow, that's way too Pollyannish, but the hope has to be that at some stage people ask themselves, is this the only way? Because there's nothing really that particular or peculiar to the Israel-Palestine situation in this respect. in respect of the fact that if you close off every avenue to people, if you tell them you have no diplomatic channel, no political channel, no legal channel, no, you can't hold Israel accountable in this forum or that forum, then across time and across geography, the option left is the option that involves violence, that involves armed resistance, and that involves breaking of international law. And that's where I think so many of us feel that we've failed, because those warnings that we issue to officials and policymakers day in, day out, and this may be, and I'll stop him, this may be familiar to a lot of you. You know, in the last few years at least, the main thing I met with at least is, oh wow, Daniel, you still work on the Palestinian stuff? I thought that was yesterday's story. And you tell someone this is going to blow up in your face, and people take pity on you that you still care about this.
Thank you, Daniel, for that, and thank you for reminding us of the differences between this current Israeli government, but also the similarities and continuities with previous policy toward Gaza in particular, and toward the Palestinian people in general. And I'm glad you mentioned the policy angle, because I want to segue to that, since we do have a lot of congressional staff on this call, members of the Washington, D.C. media. Let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration. Let's talk a little bit about Congress and how they've been responding to this violence that we've seen since Saturday. And I want to start by asking all of you, so far, I think we've seen that the Biden administration has given a very green light to Israel to attack Palestinians in the Gaza Strip without any seeming limits placed upon this attack. It's expressed solidarity with Israel and Israeli civilians, but there's been no mention at all coming out of the Biden administration of Palestinian civilians and innocent victims who are caught up in this as well. So what I'm hoping is that each of you can share with us your impressions of the Biden administration's policies toward Israel and the Palestinian people over the past 2.5+ years, and what you think needs to be changed in terms of U.S. policy, not only in the immediate term, but broadly speaking. And Zaha and Daniel in particular, you co-authored a very important Carnegie report at the outset of the Biden administration that was entitled "Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo." Maybe if you could speak to that and what the Biden administration has seemed to miss about your recommendations in that report. So I'll just leave that for anyone to start with, and you can jump in.
Zaha, please.
Okay, thanks. Well, first to the first part of your question. So where is the U.S. administration at the moment? I mean, I just picked up my phone and I saw that there was a tweet by the president talking about, the affinity with Israel, and how anything that happens to Israeli civilians, these are friends and family of the United States, and the U.S. is in the same place as Israel essentially, but nothing on the loss of life in Gaza, Palestinians dying at the hands of the Israeli military in the West Bank too, as well. Nothing about that. And from the very onset, there has been this sense that the administration is afraid to acknowledge Palestinian humanity. We saw a tweet from the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, in which he had mentioned a ceasefire, and then that was immediately deleted. We saw from the Office of Palestinian Affairs a tweet that talked about, not falling for retaliatory attacks, and to refrain from that kind of violence, and then that was deleted. So what is the message that is to be taken from the fact that the administration feels like it can't even say that there shouldn't be a tit for tat with respect to the senseless killing of civilians, if those civilians are Palestinian? And so this has an extremely dehumanizing effect. And in order to have this kind of mass killing, that's the first thing that happens. You have to dehumanize the other side. And so this is what's really concerning for me. Yesterday, I was watching CNN, and I was watching Jake Tapper interview Senator Cruz. And he asked him, is there any way to avoid mass atrocities in Gaza? There's 1 million children in Gaza. Gaza is a very young population. And he said, no, there isn't. And we're just going to have to understand that Israel can't coexist with these people. I mean, that's an invitation to ethnic cleansing. That's an invitation to a massacre. And it's very, very frightening to have, elected officials saying this on a mainstream news channel and have the reporter not push back on that. He was just silent in that response. And so this is what we're facing right now. We're facing this complete dehumanization of Palestinian life. And it makes for very difficult conversations about Palestinian, what should be done policy-wise. So no one wants to touch the issue of, okay, Israel has a right to self-defense, has a right to protect its people, but in the context of international law, with those guardrails. Sorry, thanks for correcting me, Josh. It was Senator Rubio that said that, not Cruz. And so this is where we are. We're international law has not been referenced. Even the Secretary General of the UN, in his remarks, talked about condemning Hamas for the civilian deaths, but expressing alarm at Palestinian deaths. Like, there's no condemnation and no, sorry, my office mates, no condemnation of Israel, or no warning and no call for a ceasefire, and no warning that they should not be attacking civilians. And so I'll stop there and let Daniel comment further. I don't want to take up all of the time.
Thanks, Zaha. I mean, if I can just add to that, and I'm consuming less American media, which is perhaps not a bad thing after what we just heard. Look, my take on this administration's approach is actually the political and geopolitical framing that shifted in the last administration, in the Trump administration, has been continued. So I think we've had, by and large, an Israeli-Palestinian policy where the pen holder has been Jared Kushner. And that has been the approach of the Biden administration. And without being partisan, I think that's shameful. And they have continued to pursue, and I think they've really been caught out here, because they have continued to pursue this make-believe fantasy that if you can create normal relations between Israel and distant Arab states, and Israel and those Arab states are not at war, they've barely lifted a finger in anger at each other, then you are making peace. And you're doing it by marginalizing and neglecting the actual issue that needs addressing, the issue of Palestine, Israel, the dispossession and occupation of Palestinians. So there's been this tremendous disconnect. And what I worry about is that if you keep telling yourself the lie that this is how you make peace, then you lose eye contact with the reality. And I think that's what's gone on. with this administration. I also think the administration is perhaps aware, but perhaps unaware of just how little credibility this gives them when they try and stand up as a normative actor for international law and for the rule of law in one place, and they have nothing to say against a promise of a war crime by an allied government who they are going to arm in order to help commit that. And people probably understand exactly what I'm referring to. And when people have turned around during the Ukraine crisis and said, where is the rest of the world? Why aren't they siding with us? They're not going to side with you on this either. Because they cannot abide by the self-gratifying hypocrisy that is on display. And it's I think it's really bad for America. And what also I think we have to be angry about is the wasted opportunity. There has essentially been a period of quite prolonged quiet. And not only did they fail to act politically with the traditional actors, they did nothing to try and bring a political track in here. That was always considered too hard. They didn't even stop to consider, what does it mean? You know, there's a lot of talk at the moment. Hamas is ISIS. You know, we've got to, do you know what the position of Israel has been for most of the last decade and a half? And in particular for the last decade, Israel has had a permanent channel of communication to Hamas. We won't even go back into the history of where did Hamas come from and how it was useful as a balancing act vis-a-vis Fatah and the PLO in the 80s. But for the last decade, there have been prolonged periods of an agreed tahadiyah, period of calm, more than a ceasefire. So Israel knows full well that it can be in a political engagement. Doesn't matter that it's via third parties with Hamas. But rather than explore that and rather than have a responsible outside actor, which theoretically would be America, explore that and say, okay, where can we go next with this? Israel didn't want a political track, so it used that tahadiyah to do precisely nothing except create the circumstances. And in fact, get caught out because it didn't take seriously Hamas's growing asymmetrical warfare capacity. And here, you know, my warning to my Israeli friends is, when America acts hubristically, it still has Mexico, Canada, and water surrounding it. It has to go overseas to test itself, come up short because its hubris is in play, and then retreat back home. But when it encourages its allies to act hubristically, and it doesn't just apply to Israel, the consequences are far more severe.
Thanks, Daniel. Let me turn it over to Hani.
Great, thanks. I speak as an American voter. It's just impressive to see how many public officials are frothing at the mouth, talking about war and finishing people. You've seen that tweet from Nikki Haley, for example, finish him, Netanyahu. We're playing video games, apparently. She's not talking about humans and families. And in reality, you look at this and then you wonder, like American Muslims, who are they gonna look at this issue and say, like, hey, like, who's better in this, right? And it's gonna really cause a lot of damage in the community when we have people, hey, vote for this person or that, when we know that none of them is showing up for their voters. Now, just to give you a point of contract, Zaha and I were just fighting the fight with the visa waiver, and Josh, the visa waiver program about entry and the discriminations against many Palestinian-Americans. And right now, I know at least 20 Palestinian-Americans stuck in Gaza. And guess what? Nobody at the embassy is picking up. Unreachable embassy. But they have time to find, oh, they have 10 American victims from that side. But guess what? In Rimal neighborhood, there is many American Palestinians own properties there, and it's damaged. Zero silence. This is the discrimination we face, and it's like, hey, this is normal. If we give, you know, there's a lot of Palestinians who are stuck with their families. I know a family from Jersey with a 2-month baby who were not able to leave, and they just bombed Rafah. They found a way to go through Egypt, and when Rafah was bombed, they can't leave. There is a lot of conversations. We Palestinian Americans look and say like, hey, maybe Biden is the wrong choice, but the other guys are not really good. So it's very toxic. Where do we turn? And that's just demoralizing. And we want our people to vote. We like to vote, but we look and say like, hey, the guys in Gaza, they have Toyota pickup trucks, and the Israelis have warships, and that frustrates me. And I just, I see Mara here, our executive director, in the call. I don't know if you care to add anything to that.
Mara, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting off of mute and putting my video on. This is always a difficult moment because I want to speak from an individual viewpoint, and I'm often stuck speaking from an institutional viewpoint. And UNRWA, of course, is in a position of neutrality. It's hard to understand what neutrality means in a setting like we've all been witnessing that has been so incredibly painful. I'm the executive director of UNRWA USA, and we work hand in hand with UNRWA to provide the essential food, health, housing, education, and protection services that we can to the 6 million Palestine refugees. And we've been, of course, UNRWA's been in Gaza for a long time and is really themselves bearing the brunt of the siege that is happening right now. And it has, I could just tell you from an individual point of view for a moment, as a Jewish American whose grandfather escaped Nazi Germany and said never again. It didn't apply to just Jewish people or, any particular group, but to anybody. And what we're witnessing is something that should be condemned and is outrageous on many levels. And we should understand the outrageousness of all civilian deaths, whether on the Palestinian side or on the Israeli side. I'd be happy to speak when the moment is right about what UNRWA is doing on the ground and the enormous challenges being faced right now on the ground.
Yeah, Mara, maybe if you want to add in on that right now, because I want to save a few minutes for the panelists to address the congressional angle.
Absolutely. So right now there are approximately 187,000 displaced Palestine refugee civilians within Gaza. 137,000 of those are seeking shelter in UNRWA schools. They're all of the 14 food distribution sites that UNRWA normally runs, which are able to reach 500,000 Palestine refugees in need of food assistance, are closed because of the unsafe conditions, obviously, and therefore food distribution is not happening. And from what we understand, with the help of the World Food Program, there is some bread being distributed in the 83 UNRWA schools that are serving as shelters at this moment. UNRWA's headquarters in Amman has been hit and has sustained severe damage. And of course, as was mentioned before, in terms of GPS, the locations of UNRWA's headquarters has definitely been known by the Israelis. And in total, 18 UNRWA installations have been damaged since the attacks, the bombing started on October 7th. Meanwhile, of the 22 UNRWA health centers, 15 of them are operational, but only in shortened hours, again, because of safety conditions. Right now, of course, because of the sealed border, we're not able to get additional food or emergency services into Gaza, but there are many, including World Central Kitchen, who are eager to support, and we're waiting to see what can be done from the Egyptian side.
Thank you so much, Mara, for that account of UNRWA's challenges in this time. And thanks to UNRWA and UNRWA USA for all the important work that you're doing to provide these much needed humanitarian services. In the few minutes we have left, I'd like the panelists to reflect on some of the legislative initiatives that we're seeing out of Congress. This week, the House and the Senate are expected to introduce resolutions on the violence that we've seen since Saturday. A draft of a resolution by Chair Mike McCall and Ranking Minority Member Gregory Meeks of the House Foreign Affairs Committee calls for more weapons to Israel. It calls for a tightening of the Israeli siege on Gaza. And its only mention of Palestinian fatalities is to blame Hamas for Israel's actions in killing Palestinian civilians. Meanwhile, in the Senate, we've heard that the acting Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chair, Ben Cardin, has announced his intention to seek more weapons for Israel and to introduce a resolution in solidarity with Israel, probably with no mention of solidarity for the Palestinian people who are experiencing violence as well. I'd like for the panelists in maybe 1 minute each to reflect upon these congressional initiatives. And more importantly, I think, to say what you think Congress should be doing to promote the safety and peace that everyone, Palestinians and Israelis alike, deserve. Let's start with Hani.
I mean, just the siege was already damaging Gaza. Before this happened, the biggest issue I've been tackling as a Palestinian is the long lines of young Palestinian men and women trying to get visas to Turkey so they can smuggle themselves to Europe. That's, is it 60% or 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza are under the poverty line. And when poverty happens, you're basically leaving Hamas to be the only or the biggest employer in Gaza. And that's not sustainable. Just some of you are aware that, some of us were fighting with Congress to allocate more funds for food assistance, for example, for Gaza. And that was a big fight. And, there is basic needs in Gaza that are not met. In Gaza, the electricity, if you buy electricity, it's 5 times more what we pay than in the US. Gasoline is 6 times what we pay. I'm sorry, the gasoline is double what the US paid. For gallon, it's $6.60 a gallon. Now we can't even get it at that price in Gaza. So everything in Gaza, as Zaha said, from birth to death and between, is controlled by Israel. No matter what they say, we drew troops in 2005. It's all, if I want to leave Gaza, I appealed in July to the Israelis to let me out. They said no. So we went through the very tough process in Egypt. So for folks to think the last 20 years siege on Gaza or 15 years siege of Gaza helped, if this is the right politics, congratulations, that's what they get, situation where both civilians are endangered. So this is where a place where they need a paradigm shift. And I hope the Palestinians, despite the tragedies we see, I talk to you and my eye on my phone to just make sure that nobody with the same last name as mine and my wife we see. So this is not sustainable. Every 2 years, we have a conflict like that. That's not sustainable. It needs leadership. And I yield anytime I have to Zaha.
Yeah, actually, I want to turn it over to Daniel and leave Zaha with the last word, if that's okay.
Good with me. Let me just say this. I just find that there's this disconnect, the 3 disconnects. First of all, between where I understand American public sentiment to be at, and especially the sentiment of the supporters of the Democrat Party. And there's this growing disconnect between that public sentiment, which I'm sure is reeling also from the images of the weekend, but understands the basic questions of fairness and the need for equality and to treat Palestinians and Israelis as humans. I think there's a disconnect between the understanding that is increasingly available to those who follow this and who are reading the materials that are put out by Palestinian organizations, by Israeli human rights groups, by the international human rights community, that have made a very credible legal case that the regime applied by Israel to Palestinians is committing the crime of apartheid, and the former head of the Mossad is designated as such, alongside other important Israeli figures. A disconnect between that and between this language that one hears coming out of America and the disconnect I referred to earlier. This disconnect between international law is right in one place and it doesn't matter a damn in the other. And all I want to say is, please, America, do not walk Palestinians and Israelis down the path to hell. Because what you are encouraging is war. And war is the worst thing. And that's what we're seeing right now. Do not be warmongers. You know what? In Ukraine, you can at least make the argument you're fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. I fear that on the question of Palestine, closer to the truth would be to say you're fighting an election battlefield in Pennsylvania or Florida or Arizona to the last Palestinian and Israeli, and that's horrendous. Thanks.
Just very quickly, I don't have much to add to what Hani and Daniel shared, and I know we're already over time, but clearly this situation between Israel and Palestinians is not going to be solved by weapons. If it was solvable by weapons, then it would have been more than solved by now, given the nature and the scope of the security assistance that the U.S. provides Israel. The only way this ends and keeps Palestinians and Israelis safe and with a future that is one worth living is for the U.S. to be engaged with the parties on a political horizon, one that's consistent with international law, and one that advances accountability for human rights violations, whoever is responsible for them. Only that way can we ensure that an end to an impunity, and also to get us on track for a more sane U.S. policy towards the region.
Thank you, Zaha. We've seen in the questions and answers requests for the recording of this webinar. We will be posting it later onto our website and also distributing it to email for those of you in congressional offices. Please do feel free to share that with whomever in your offices would like to see the recording. And just to leave the audience, and especially those of you who are joining us from congressional offices, with a final takeaway message from this webinar. Congress and the Biden administration need to do whatever it takes to save lives now, not to exacerbate the violence with a knee-jerk response of providing Israel with more weapons, which will only make the U.S. more complicit in Israel's war crimes that are taking place as we speak against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. These war crimes have already targeted hospitals, ambulances, schools, mosques, residential buildings, in violation of all human rights standards and all international law canons. And I plead with you, those of you who have access to those who make the decisions, to think very carefully about providing this one-sided support for further Israeli militarization, because as Zaha mentioned, militarization is certainly not the answer. We need a fundamental transformation of U.S. policy toward Palestinian people, toward Israel, that's based on justice and freedom and equality, and that no longer upholds our role in Israel's oppression and apartheid regime of rule over the Palestinian people. With that, I want to really thank our panelists today, Hani, Mara, Zaha, Daniel, for your incredible analysis and insights. And a special thanks to Hani for joining us on this very, very difficult day for him. And again, our condolences to you and your family. And as we close, we pray for the safety and peace of all civilians, Palestinians and Israelis alike. Thank you very much for joining us.